So if you don't want to be in the video, go ahead and turn off your camera. That's okay. I am Kathy Shelton, one of the world language specialists at ODE. My colleague Ryan's on here. A little shout out there to Ryan. And also a big thank you to OFLA, who I think there's some OFLA people on here who are letting us use their Zoom account, which makes it a little bit easier, I think, than trying to use Teams. I am putting in the chat box the session materials, and Ryan will keep copying that for me once I get started here. Also, if you need closed captionings, I do have them enabled. And so on the bottom of your screen on the toolbar, you should, or wherever your toolbar is, you should see something that has a CC or a transcript. So if you need closed captions, you can go ahead and click on there. Okay, and we are recording. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and I'm going to get started. Thank you to everyone for coming to our sessions this week. We had the keynote and two fantastic sessions this morning. If you weren't able to make them, we're setting up a folder where we'll have all the materials. So if you weren't able to make one this morning, once we get the recordings, we'll put the materials, we'll put everything in there so you can still access it. Also, I know some of you had attended them and missed the survey link for the contact hour. So I'll include that in the folder too. So if you attended a session this morning and didn't get the survey link, you'll be able to find it in there. So this afternoon we have my OTES session, which probably not as fun as all the other sessions that have been going on, but so we'll do the OTES session and then till around 2:15-ish, it probably won't take that long. And then at 2:20, we have Shauna Torrington is going to do a session on reducing anxiety in the world language classroom. And then tomorrow we have some more sessions and Thursday we have some more sessions. So the focus of everything is just is high quality practices, high quality materials. How do we help kids continue to advance in face of disrupted learning, et cetera. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see which handouts I'm focusing on. So if you open the Google folder, which Ryan put the link in the chat box for you, and I am going to actually be looking at handout number 1. So if you want to go ahead, well, actually, as you can see in here, there's the handout we're going to be using. There's rubrics. There's all sorts of things related to OTES in the folder. And then we have a full web page also for ODE. So I am going to go ahead and if you want to open up that handout number 1, that's the one we're going to be looking at. I'll make mine a little bit bigger. Now it is a view only copy, but feel free to make a copy for your own if you want to take notes, etc. while I'm talking, feel free to do that. Sorry, I'm just rearranging stuff on my screen so I can see what I'm doing here. Okay, and if you have questions throughout, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and Ryan is going to monitor the chat box for me. So I'm happy to answer them as we go. If it's something that I think we'll get to a little bit later, then I'll let you know that also. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do is just let you know, and like I said, here's the folder up here at the top of the handout, so you have access to this. The first thing I wanted to do is talk about OTES 1.0, the old one, versus 2.0, the new one. So this was supposed to go into effect in 2020, but of course, you know, the world went crazy in 2020. So luckily, it doesn't go into effect until this year, till this fall. And some schools have already piloted it. So some of you may already be familiar with this. Other schools, you may be like, I didn't even know anything about it. Everything has been too stressful. So we're going to talk about the differences first between 1.0 and 2.0. One thing to keep in mind is the piece about gathering data and showing that your kids made growth. This year does not count. So I want to put, and I'll keep saying that throughout. So this year, when you're trying to figure out what's the best way for me to gather data and show that my kids, my students made growth, this year, you don't have to actually have, I think you have to put it in the rubric, but it doesn't count like towards your evaluation. So this is a great year to experiment, to sort of try different things and be like, oh, this didn't work, I'm going to try this. So just keep in mind that the part about data that I'm focusing on today this is sort of like a test year for you also, it won't count. So the first thing is that for OTES 1.0, as you recall, the student growth measure was a separate component of your teacher's evaluation. It was a 50% component, and then they changed it to, it could be like 35% with 15% of something else. But the difference was that up to half of your evaluation depended on how your kids scored on this post-assessment. That is gone, luckily. I think they have changed it now. And now the focus is, I think, on something that's much more appropriate for us and relatable for us as teachers, is the focus now is on how do you use the data that you've gathered? So how do you use it to set goals, to improve student learning, to monitor their learning, et cetera? So the goal now is, how do I use the data, the test scores or whatever you're using? How do I use all that and use it to inform my instruction and improve student learning? Sorry, I have a cat that's trying to help me get this presentation. So in the rubric, you'll see, and you have access to the rubric in the folder. If you look in the folder, it's number, where is it? It's way down here. It says PDF. It says Ohio Teacher Performance Rubric OTES 2.0. So you have access to the rubric if you want to look at it. So the good thing now is that this whole piece about data and what do I do with the data and how do I know the kids are learning, that's just embedded into the new rubric. And it's only one line in the rubric, and it doesn't outweigh anything else. So when you look at the rubric, you'll see that there's all things about classroom environment and instructional practices and assessment and data. So it's much more, I think, just calming for the teachers. It's not like it's such an intense thing that the kids' test scores were so important into everything I do. The test scores are important, of course, or the assessment scores are important, but the most important part is, what are we doing as a teacher with this data? So that's a huge difference. The OTES 1.0 rubric was aligned to the Ohio standards for the teaching profession, and the 2.0 rubric is also aligned to the Ohio standards for the teaching profession. You may not even know we had those. So just like we have learning standards for the students, we also have standards for teachers. So if you've never taken a look at those, I put a link in there so you can look at them. They're pretty straightforward. The good thing is the new rubric is also much more simplified. It's very clear. The level descriptors are very clear, et cetera. And there's a lot more local control in the new OTES 2.0. Which can be good, because then the districts can choose what's most appropriate for their students, but it also can be bad, because then sometimes it's like, well, what are we supposed to do? And it's sort of up to the district to decide. So there's good and bad with that. OTES 1.0, the final teacher evaluation was sort of that mathematical, like 80%, and I forget all the numbers in that. The next one, or in the 2.0, now you're just evaluated holistically across all the areas. Okay, so it's sort of like when we use a rubric for grading our students for, different areas, how they do in vocab, how they do in this, and then you sort of eyeball it, and holistically, that's what it's focused on. You also, every teacher sets up a professional growth plan, which is typically set up in the spring after your final evaluation in the spring. So your teacher evaluation now is based on the holistic rubric and how are you aligning to your growth plan. So basically, the goal is that your administrator or whoever's doing the evaluation looks at the preponderance of the evidence to figure out where you are. It's not like, okay, you've got 50% here and 30% here. So it's a much more, as world language teachers, it's very familiar to us because it's the same way that we use rubrics. OTES 1.0, since we do not have a state test or any type of value-added test, we had to do SLOs, as did any other area. SLOs are no longer allowed. So for us, or for any area that doesn't have a state test. So no more SLOs. If you recall, we had that document, it was like 6 or 8 pages long, where you had to document everything. However, a lot of you, as we worked throughout the years, a lot of you had really nice assessments that you had a pre-assessment and a post-assessment that you put within the SLO. You can still use that piece of it. And we're going to talk a little bit, excuse me, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But the difference is that it's just now focused on the data you get from the assessments. You don't have to do that whole 6-page form that you have to do before, but you can still use your assessments, because I know a lot of you worked really hard.
Kathy, we have a quick question.
Yes.
Darlene Lyon would like to know, she said, is the growth plan in the spring something new? We're writing them due by October. Oh,
no, sorry. I know a lot of times it's something that they look at in the spring, but whatever the due date by your district is fine. Sorry, I shouldn't have said it's only spring. I didn't need to put it that way. So the growth plan is not new. The dates that you do it within your district may vary. That's a good question. Thank you. Okay, in OTES 1.0, and this may not apply to all of you, but some of you it did. Some districts were using shared attribution, which was where the teachers didn't even do the pre and post assessment for their content. The district, for example, took all the 10th grade math results, and that was everybody's teacher evaluation was based on that. And that was called shared attribution. That is no longer allowed under OTES 2.0. So for those of you who did SLOs in the past, who didn't do shared attribution, the 2.0 is sort of going to be a lot easier. You're going to be like, okay, this is much less cumbersome than it used to be. If you never did an SLO in the past and you never had to do the pre and post assessment and setting target for growth and everything, this is going to be something that's new because you didn't have to do it in the past. Okay, prior in OTES 1.0, if you recall, you had to give a pre-test in the beginning of the year, and then the post-test was given usually March or April at the end of the year to show growth. And if you recall, everybody was frantically trying to give these pre-assessments the first week of school because we wanted to allow a window for as much growth as possible with our students, and the students were just overwhelmed with all these protests, or I'm sorry, not protests, pre-tests, or maybe protests. The time period has now been changed, and the time period is now determined by the district, and it can vary by teacher. So it's no longer that you give the pre-test like the first week of school and you give the post-test in April. Now the district can determine. So the district may say, we want you to give a quarter-long growth assessment, or we want you to assess growth over the period of a semester, or they may say the whole year, but it's all determined by the district. So it's no longer ODE or the state legislature saying you have to use this period. The district should determine it. The one thing you want to be careful of, especially in world languages where we go based on proficiency growth, is that the districts want to make sure that it's a long enough period of instruction that you actually have time to impact student learning. I had a teacher who wrote to me and said that in her district, the principal said that they just had to do a pre and a post test for 1 unit of study and show growth. And she's like, I'm frantic because I can't show proficiency growth over just 1 unit, which is true. So the goal is make sure when you're talking to your administrator, it should be a period of instruction that's long enough, especially as world language teachers, that we can truly show that we have made an impact on students' proficiency levels. Because since we're not really content, it's hard to do achievement because it's not like I had some information, I didn't have information at the beginning, and now I have information at the end. We're really going on their proficiency levels, which is longer, it takes longer than a unit. Okay, prior in OTES 1.0, you gave the pre-test, you gave the post-test, and that was your data points. They suggested a lot of other measurements as possible, but basically a pre and post-test was it. In the 2.0, however, now if you do a pre and a post assessment, that only serves as 1 data point. And you have to have at least 2 data points or more. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So even if like the tested areas who are doing, and I don't want to speak to the tested areas because I'm not, that's not part of our content area. So even if you gave a pre and a post test, you still have to have at least 1 other way that you're showing, documenting growth.
Kathy, another good question.
Yeah.
Have the ODE world language consultants put together any kind of an info sheet for admin to help support us in these conversations?
That, Dawn, that's a really great thing to add, because we have it used to be our SLO page, which we're converting to our OTES page for world languages, where we're going to put a lot of resources. I love that idea to have an FAQ sheet for administrators regarding it. If Ryan, can you copy that and email it to me? That's a fantastic idea, Dawn, to give sort of an FAQ for administrators about how it works. Because the teachers, you go on our OTES page and you're like, oh yeah, I totally know what this means. But administrators, if they don't have a background in specific content areas, they may have more questions. So that's a fantastic idea, and we are definitely going to include that, Dawn. Okay, before in OTES 1.0, the student scores and the targets, remember you had to have that whole chart where you said this student was novice low 1, and I'm going to try and get them to novice high 1. And you had to document every single student and every single piece of proficiency. In the OTES 2.0 rubric, that no longer exists. It's basically, and this is directly from the rubric, the teacher uses at least 2 sources of high quality student data, which we said already, and they show clear evidence of growth for most of the students. And that's all it says. Like when you go in and you look at the sheet that you have to turn in at the end, it's just one sheet that says, here's how I showed growth, here's the data that I have, but there's no chart where you have to document it like we had to in the old SLOs. The other thing to keep in mind is that the district determines how the teacher is going to document the evidence and what does growth for most student means. Because for example, in the past, it was sort of like you had to have, I forget how it was, like the majority of your students, I forget what exactly that language was for the SLO before. And so teachers would be like, okay, I'm going to do all my level 1 kids because that's where I have most of my students. Now, what does most students mean is completely up to the district. So your administrator might say, okay, you have to have growth for at least, show growth for at least 51% of your students. They may say 90% of your students.
Bless you.
They have to tell
No,
you.
I'm on mute.
Oh yeah, somebody's not on mute. I'm not sure who's talking. Michelle, I think. Yeah, there we go. There you go. Okay, and then the district also determines how you're going to document that evidence. So like I said, a lot of the control that used to be at the state level has now gone to the local level. So these are important questions to ask when I'm sure most of you are getting ready for your back to school staff meetings. These are the questions to ask. How do we document evidence of growth? How many students do we have to show growth for? Okay, so those, again, that's a huge difference from how it used to be. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Okay, now, so that was sort of what it used to be, and those are the major changes. Now, the next one, there's a link to the 2.0 rubric. It's live here on the document, and it's also, if you're in the folder, and you scroll down, like I said, it's about the 6th one down where it says the evaluation rubric. So this is the entire rubric. I'm only going to focus on the high quality student data, but, and I know my screen's a little bit small, but if you go in and look, you can see it talks about data. It talks about connecting to the standards. It talks about whole child instruction. It talks about communication with students and parents, professional growth, et cetera. So that's, it's a typical rubric for teacher evaluation, but that gives you all the points. What I want to focus on specifically is this. There's one section of the rubric here I'm going to show you, and then there's another one. And this, I believe, is the first element on the rubric. And this talks about how teachers use high quality student data. Now, the one thing I do want to mention, and when I was making my presentation, I worked with, if you know Catherine Everidge Fry, she is our sort of our OTES guru, and she and I worked together on the presentation so I could make sure I had everything accurate with what I was saying. The one thing she wanted me to point out is the rubric has ineffective, developing, skilled, and accomplished. And of course, all of us as teachers were like, I totally need to be accomplished. She's like, just make sure to point out that skilled doesn't just mean like you're only, it's like you're a B teacher, like if you were giving a grade. She said skilled is actually an excellent, excellent teacher. So she's like, I know teachers tend to get, a little stressed that, oh my gosh, I'm only skilled and I'm not accomplished. So she did want me to make sure to point out that skilled is really a very high performing target. So when I'm focusing today on what we're looking for in OTES 2.0, I'm going to focus on the skilled column. But I know as teachers, we're all like, but I got to get the last column. So anyway, so if you look at the skilled column, when they're talking about using high quality student data, you can notice what you have to do in here. And I sort of mentioned it earlier. So the teacher, can you see my rubric or my pointer? Yeah. So the teacher thoroughly and correctly analyzes patterns and at least 2 sources of high quality student data. So that's what we were talking about before. So you want to analyze the patterns and you want to develop measurable and appropriate growth goals, and you want to monitor progress. So it's similar to what we did in OTES 1.0. We look at the data, we set the growth goals, and then we monitor the progress. It's just a little less of that heavy of I've got to document every single student on this chart and then put where they were afterwards. This is just typical, when we give an assessment, whether it's formative or summative, we put their grades in the grade book or portfolio or however you're doing assessment. So you will have the data in front of you. That does go back to that question with the administrator about, okay, how do you want us to show the evidence? And that, again, is totally up to the administrator. They may say, I want it in a spreadsheet. They may want to say, I want to see a grade book. I have no idea how administrators will do it. That's something that you'll have to check with them. But again, for us as teachers, we're gathering data all the time, especially world languages. We are constantly doing all the formative and summative assessments. So we have to use at least 2 sources of that data to set the goals and monitor the progress towards the goals. So that was the first thing I want to point out within the rubric as far as the data piece. Because of all the questions I've gotten from teachers over the past several months about OTES 2.0, the number one question is what's high quality student data, which is why that's the focus of the presentation. I think the rest of the rubric, like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot clearer. It's very straightforward what you have to do. Oh, what's also nice in the rubric, and I don't think I have it in the folder, but it's on the ODE, OTES 2.0 page, is there's a version for administrators that actually has an editable row under each section of the rubric. So like when they're looking at section 1.1, they can actually type right into the rubric and talk about what you did. So it's nicer for administrators, and it'll be nicer for the teachers because you'll be able to actually see the notes that your administrator was taking during the evaluation, or whoever's doing it. Okay, when Catherine and I were talking, when we were working on this presentation, I said to her, I said, you know, just what's the nuts and bolts? What's the core of what we're trying to do here with 2.0? And she gave me 3 guiding questions to think about from the teacher point of view and from the evaluator point of view. The very first question is basically, what is useful high quality student data? So that's the first thing. And we want to get data that, and it, before how we, you know, how we sort of focused on the weaknesses, we sort of said what's as low as the student can get and as high as we can get. Now you have the option of focusing on strengths or weaknesses or both when you're showing the growth. So the first question we want to figure out is how do I get good data that shows me strengths and weaknesses, and it gives me, you know, all the students, individual students, et cetera. So again, you can see why giving just one assessment, it's going to be difficult to try and get all of this with just one assessment. So that's the first thing, is how do I what's actual useful data, which we're going to talk about. The second part, and this goes into the rubric, the second guiding question is how did the teacher analyze, reflect on, and make decisions based on that data? So I gathered all this data. How did I use it to inform my instruction and improve learning? And then the third piece, this third question, which we're going to look at the end on which is the last, I believe it's like the last section on the rubric. What's the evidence that it helped the teacher impact learning? So 3 things. What is good data? How am I using the data to help students grow? And where's my evidence that the students grew? So it's basically what we do as teachers. I mean, it just reflects what we do. We just have to be a little bit more intentional about actually providing evidence to our observer or administrator that we actually impacted learning. Okay, so you have in there, in the folder, the high quality student data guidance tool. And if you look at, if you're in the folder, it's the handout after number 4. I guess I probably should have numbered it number 5. So you have an HQSD guidance tool, and I'm going to go ahead and pull it up here too so you can see it. And all of the handouts I'm giving you, well, except for the first one is mine, but everything else is on the ODE page. So, and I actually have this on my, we're going to go through this step by step, but there's 2 things you have to have. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see it better. When you're trying to get high quality student data, you have to have 2 things. So you have to have a data instrument, which basically means how the tool that you're using to gather the data. It has to be rigorously reviewed by locally determined experts in the field of education, which I'm going to show you some things that we have, and it has to meet all of the following criteria. So it has to align to the learning standards. It has to measure what it's supposed to measure. This one, and like I said, I'm going to go over all of these individually. It has to be attributed to you for what you taught this year. So if you are teaching stuff, if you're teaching French 2 and you're doing French 1 material that is a review of something they used last year, you wouldn't count that. We want data for what you're actually doing this year. Not that you wouldn't integrate that into it with the new French 2 stuff, and then that would be okay. But if you're just like, okay, we're going to review, you know, pronouns for masculine, feminine, or whatever, that's not really new material. The tool has to provide evidence of student learning, and in ours it's going to be growth with proficiency. It has to follow the protocols for administration, which is, we don't really have a test, so it's a little bit, doesn't apply just as much. It has to give trustworthy results, and it can't be driven by bias. Okay, so that's the first thing. We're going to break that down and talk about, and then I'll go back to this. So if we flip back to the handout. So let's break down what all of that means, because that's a lot. Okay, so the first one, the instrument must align to the learning standards. So if a lot of you I know have seen our new 2020 standards, some of you may not. They literally got approved by the state board on like March 10th. And we all know what happened on March 13th when in 2020, when the whole world sort of, schools, every school building shut down on March 13th or whatever, Friday the 13th, if I recall. So some of you may be like, I was so caught up in COVID and everything, I never even looked at the new standards. So I put a link to the new standards on there. I'm not going to do a standards presentation today. I have recordings and stuff that you can take a look at, and we'll do some other ones later. But basically, the old standards were by grade bands. We had grades, like we had K6, 6, 8, 9, 12. That no longer exists for world languages. World language standards are now aligned with proficiency levels from novice low to advanced low. There is no grade band. Now we have the targets that we've always given, like what's typical for a first year French student or something like that, or an elementary immersion student, but there is no more grade bands. So when you are gathering data for OTES 2.0, it has to be data that is aligned to proficiency levels that's outlined in the standards. This is actually advantageous for teachers because I know one of the issues under OTES, the previous OTES 1.0, was that a lot of administrators wanted the language teachers to give a multiple choice test and say, okay, just give me data with multiple choice tests and what was their percent to start with and what was their percent to end with. And we were constantly saying no, because that's not how language works. We're proficient, we're a skill, we're not a content. So, but it was hard to reflect that in our standards the way they were before, even though we all sort of knew it intuitively and from all our PD. So now the new standards are completely aligned to proficiency levels. So if your administrator is saying you have to just give a multiple choice test, you can show them our standards and say, there's no way to align a multiple choice test with our standards. So it has to include intercultural competence across reading, listening, reviewing, interpersonal communication, whether it's spoken or written or signed, and then presentational writing, speaking, or signing. So that's the number one very important piece, that with the OTES 2.0, when you're gathering the data, it has to be aligned to our 2020 standards.
Kathy, we have a question, and it kind of goes with your next bullet, but it's worth asking. If the data instrument has to be attributable to a specific teacher, does that mean, for example, that two teachers who teach a section of level 2 cannot both use the same common assessment as an instrument?
No, because you will be getting, wait, you're both, I'm looking at the question here. You're both teaching level 2, right?
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, okay, so both teachers, so you're both teaching Spanish 2 or whatever, and you give a common assessment. No, that's totally appropriate. Because when you give that common assessment, whether it's a semester assessment or a final exam, that's fine, because it's what your students in your class produce is based on what you have taught them this year. What you can't do is take, this goes back to what I was saying before, like if you spend September reviewing French 1 material and French 2 class, none of that French 1, I mean, you're reviewing it, but it's something that they've already learned. The goal, and I think if you were on the keynote this morning, is that obviously kids always need review in the fall. We're not saying don't review. The goal is to continue on with the level 2 or whatever your class is, level 2 material, while spiraling in and reviewing the level 1 material within the level 2. So the goal is to constantly be moving forward with new material while continually to spiral old material, which I think we all do. But what we're trying to get away from is, you know how it is. I know as a teacher, I used to do it too, is I'd spend like a couple of weeks just reviewing everything that they learned the prior year. And I hated it and they hated it. And it's like, no, let's just move on with the new stuff. And we'll keep bringing in the old stuff because language has to constantly be spiraled anyway. I hope that answers the question. I feel like I gave a roundabout answer, but I hope that answered it. So as long as you can use common assessments, you can use common instruments, common rubrics, because you're assessing your students based on what you taught. Was there another question, Ryan? I see like a lot popping up, or am I going to?
I just answered it.
Oh,
It was just asking, someone was hoping it wasn't all those standards all at the same time.
Right, we're going to get to that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, did I miss that on my? Oh, I know I get to it at some point. Yeah. Okay. So so when the student or the tool to be aligned to the standards, the good thing about world languages is over the last 7-8 years in Ohio, most of us, based on all the PD and ACTFL and Assessful and the can-dos, the majority of teachers that I interact with in Ohio are doing proficiency assessments. I mean, I'm not saying there's never any grammar or vocab or whatever, but we are all familiar with the proficiency levels. We're doing performance assessments, we're doing IPAs, you're doing portfolio, some of you, et cetera. But we are very familiar in Ohio with what is required in H2, in the OTES 2.0. So if you've been doing performance assessments, you've been doing the summative assessments, you've been doing growth aligned to proficiency levels for the different skills, culture, you are already doing what you need to do as far as developing assessment. As far as getting the HQSD, the data, you're going to have to make sure you're getting data using proficiency rubrics, which like I said, I know most of the teachers I interact with, you're like, yes, we've been doing this for years. And I put a link on there to the ODE rubrics. And I'm just going to share my screen and you can link to it. A lot of you are already familiar with these, but if you scroll down to the rubrics, we have rubrics for speaking and writing across the proficiency levels. We have rubrics for interpersonal communication across the proficiency levels. And then we have the ACTFL rubric and their task creator for interpretive skills. When you're trying to gather high quality student data, and remember before it said you have to have a tool that has been locally reviewed by experts in the field, et cetera. The rubrics from ODE are I'm saying ODE because we're Ohio teachers and they're made and we were part of it. If you are using these rubrics to score your assessments, you are using a tool that's going to bring you high quality student data. So I know rubrics can be kind of subjective, but if your assessments are lined up to the rubrics, you are getting the type of data that you need that aligns to the standards. So again, like I said, I think for the language teachers in Ohio, for us, this is actually kind of a relief because it's like, oh my gosh, this is what we have been doing for the last, almost 10 years. So it's totally in line with what we're doing. You may also, if you want to do some sort of other assessment, I know some teachers are using the Apple or the stamp. I know some teachers use it for the seal by literacy. Some districts are using it for proficiency. There's other tests that are ODE approved that we use for the seal by literacy for some of the less common languages. Any one of those are appropriate as a pre and a post assessment if your district, approves you to use that test. And again, and this goes to the question about all the skills, et cetera. Right, you just have to pick two different components. I must have forgotten that, I think in my 1.0 versus 2.0. Before, we were assessing all 4 skills and you had to show growth across all 4 skills. It's a little bit less intense now. You can pick 2 different areas you want to focus on for the OTES part. I mean, obviously we're going to continually do all the skills, but yes, it's not like I have to show growth in reading, writing, speaking, and listening and culture for every single kid at every single level. Now you're going to focus on 2 different areas, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that below. One thing is, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, if you're giving grammar-based and multiple choice assessments, those are not going to give you high quality student data that's aligned to the standards. I'm not saying you can never give a grammar quiz or never give a multiple choice thing. That's not my decision as to what type of assessments or quizzes you give, but you can't use those if you're trying to get the high quality student data, because grammar quiz and multiple choice is not aligned to proficiency levels, because there's no way to show how did the student, show growth from novice mid to novice high. Now, one caveat to that, and I think especially those of you who have given the stamp or the Apple, or if you give the AP test, et cetera, or the IB, I'm not sure if IB, I think IB also, is that if you can use multiple choice if you're doing the interpretive skills like reading, listening, or viewing, if you're assessing deeper comprehension that's aligned to the standards. If you haven't looked at the standards yet, when you go in there for interpretive, you'll see that it's things about understanding cognates, finding organization, doing cultural comparisons. So a lot of reading, listening, and viewing skills can be done multiple choice as long as the answers are actually deeper comprehension. So it's not just like, you show a video about something and you're like, what time did the student go to bed? Or what time did he do this or whatever? But you're saying like, based on this video, what do you predict might happen next? Or what is the organization of this? Is it a biography, et cetera? So those type of multiple choice are okay because sometimes it can be hard to do all that grading, especially like during an exam or a pre or post assessment. I put a link on here to the actual Appendix D template. Those of you who have gone to my PD, you know this is like one of my favorite things ever invented that ACTFL has been generous enough to allow us to use. And the ACTFL Appendix D template, if you link to it, it gives 9 different skills for interpretive reading, viewing, or listening. And some of the skills, they get progressively harder as you go through. So if you're trying to say, you know what, I really am looking for deeper comprehension, check out this Appendix D template. The best thing about it is you don't have to do everything on it. Like you can pick and choose like activity number 1, 3, and 7, and they all work together. So multiple choice is okay in the interpretive skills. And again, I'm talking about getting high quality student data for OTES 2.0, but in general in assessments. So using deeper comprehension, multiple choice is okay if it's getting that deeper comprehension.
Kathy, we have 2 questions. The
Yeah.
first one is, are there rubrics that break out the novice low skills, since the number of hours we meet our year-end goal is novice mid at the end of level 1, and our assessor will be seeing us before we get there?
I'm going to try and answer, and if I don't answer, who is that? Suzanne. If I don't answer it correctly, Suzanne, go ahead and jump on the mic. Students, and now Chinese and the harder languages are a little bit more difficult. I understand that. But for the languages like French, Spanish, ASL, German, those students get out of novice low very quickly, because once students can use some words, phrases, and simple sentences, they're out of novice low. I'm not saying every student does, because obviously I don't want to generalize. But for example, we don't even have a novice low rubric because it's so hard, because the kids can basically only get out words or phrases. Kids quickly advance to the novice mid. I'm not sure if I'm answering what you're asking. Suzanne, if you want to jump on, go ahead. Actually, let me say one more thing. If you pull up the standards, let me pull up standards really quickly. If you pull up the standards, Suzanne, and you look at novice low, there you do have everything broken out. You have novice low broken out into the skills for reading, right, or for interpretive, interpersonal, presentational, literacy, culture. Is that maybe more what you're asking?
She said thanks, so you must have answered her.
Okay, yeah. So the breakdown of the skills all the way to novice low through advanced low, yes, is in our actual world language standards. When you're looking at the rubrics that we've designed for assessing, the rubrics start at novice mid, just because it's hard, because kids get out of novice low so quickly, and plus novice low is really just words and a few phrases. So it's hard to really do a performance assessment using novice low. I hope that helps.
Kathy, the other rubric question was, what about MYP rubrics for IB schools?
Okay, I'm not familiar enough with IB, but is that can you jump on, who is that, Ellen or Eileen? Eileen, can you jump on really quickly and explain is it a proficiency based rubric, or how does it work?
Hi. It is proficiency based. MYP, we would typically use up to 10th grade. And then for students going on to the diploma, we would use separate diploma-based, again, proficiency-based rubrics for the DP.
Yeah.
So that's what we've been using because we are an IB school. So
yes.
I'm
totally appropriate then, yes. Oh yeah, the middle years program, MYP. Okay, yeah, totally appropriate, because the IB, the AP, those are all proficiency-based assessments. Again, remember that previous question was, what evidence does your administrator allow? So as long as the administrator is okay, which I would assume they work since you're an IB, and IB is proficiency based, definitely not a problem.
Okay, just wanted to check. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a really good question. Okay, so that was the big thing about that. It has to be aligned to the standards. So basically, to sum it up in a few words, you have to be measuring proficiency as outlined in our standards, is basically it. The second criteria was it has to measure what's intended to be measured, which we sort of talked about. So your interpretive skills, interpersonal skills, presentational skills, and then intercultural communication or understanding or competence. all of these 4 areas, as well as literacy, are all outlined in the new standards. So if you have not yet looked at the 2020 standards and you're like, I'm not sure what it looks like, go into the standards. It's completely broken down into even by individual skills in the standards. And then the rubrics that I showed you also provide ways to assess all of this, but just starting with novice mid as opposed to novice low. Okay, on this one I talked about earlier. So the data has to be attributable to this year. So the new learning for this year. So like I said, we're really trying to, especially after last year with such, every kid's learning was disrupted and everything was, the kids, most teachers I've talked to, the students aren't where they typically are this year. Maybe they aren't quite as, maybe their proficiency level isn't quite as high. So, and this is based on research. And if you go back and watch the keynote recording from this morning from Instruction Partners, they're fantastic about explaining this much better than I can. But the goal is we want to continue with they call it grade level standards. We don't really have that as far as proficiency level standards, but we still want to teach what we typically teach at the level of each language course, while bringing in whatever supports they need from last year. So that way, everything you're teaching this year count and is important versus saying, oh my gosh, my kids can't even do the present tense. I'm going to have to go back and review present tense of AR verbs. I think that would be painful for them. It would be painful for you. But so how can we bring in present tense of AR verbs into what I'm currently teaching in this unit? So that's sort of what we're looking at for that. Okay, the next 4 all sort of go together. So they have to demonstrate evidence of growth. So for example, our rubrics will show you, okay, the kid or my student, when in the beginning of the assessment period, they were novice high 2. At the end of the year, they're now intermediate low 1. They have shown growth according to the standards. Oh, that's the one thing on the rubrics I forgot to point out. When you pull up our rubrics, I'll just pull up a novice high one for whatever. I should have pulled this up earlier. So this is novice high for presentational. You'll notice that our rubrics there's 2 pages. You have a single point rubric, which I know as a teacher, I love single point rubrics. Students love single point rubrics. And what we've done is, instead of just making it novice high, novice low, and novice mid or whatever, we actually break each proficiency level into 3 different levels. So you have novice high 1, which means the student is showing partial evidence for novice high. You have novice high 2, which means the student is just they are solid novice high 2. They meet all the requirements, or all the descriptors, not requirements, the descriptors. And then you can see underneath here in the middle column, that shows, okay, if I want to show that I'm novice high 2 in speaking or writing or signing, what does it look like? And we break it down for you. And then novice high 3 is my student, really probably not intermediate low, though novice high 3 is pretty close, but they're inching out of that novice high into the next level. So that's the other nice thing about using the ODE rubrics, which I'm not sure any other rubrics have it. I think ACTFLs might. I think they have like novice, like 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is sort of similar. But the nice thing about the ODE rubrics is we've broken it down into micro growth. So some of you teach in, for example, very challenging districts where students, where it's trying to even get them to novice mid is a big struggle, just because of, for whatever reasons. So what's nice about this is it's like, okay, my student was a novice, basically novice low 0 when they started. I got them to a novice mid 1. So they didn't necessarily get all the way up to a full novice mid, but I was able to show micro growth within it. These rubrics are really nice. And I don't want to tie everything just to OTES, but it's also nice for the students, because once they get out of that novice mid and try to get into novice high, it gets tough. Things break down. Language, you all know the actual pyramid. It's harder to keep moving up the pyramid. So that's what else I really like about these rubrics that the teachers helped us create, is that they break it down even like sub proficiency levels. This is nice because the students can use it for self-assessment. They can talk about what are my strengths. They can talk about their goals. And it's very easy. Like I said, single point rubric. What's nice is if you go to page 2, you have the teacher version, or some students might like this, but it might be a bit much for students, where you have the same thing. So novice high 2, which is full evidence for the level, we give you all the nitty gritty details about what it actually looks like. So these are great rubrics. I'm not saying you have to use them. I'm just saying, if you're like, I just need something that's made and is going to serve my OTES 2.0 and give me high quality student data, the ODE rubrics are already there because they're aligned to the standards. They meet everything you need. again, we didn't make these, the teachers helped us make these. We just pretty them up and put them out there. The teachers around Ohio helped us make these. But anyway, I wanted to point out that those rubrics also allow you to show that sort of micro growth, which is nice with proficiency. Okay, so that was that. Okay, so the instrument must follow protocols for administrating and scoring. I mean, that's pretty much a rubric. Trustworthy results. Again, trustworthy results, rubrics can always be sort of, people can say they're subjective, but like I said, we break it down pretty into those little individual components, what districts might want to do or teachers might want to do if you have, and I know not everybody does, but you have other teachers teaching the same language, that you sort of do some of that calibration where everybody scores an essay in Spanish on the rubric, and then you compare your results on the rubrics and you sort of say, okay, why did you do this? And you can calibrate results. If not, if you're the only teacher in there, like I said, it's very detailed what is provided in the proficiency between the standards, the rubrics, and the necessitable actual, the national can-do statements. The results you can get are pretty trustworthy without actually going to an outside test. The data instrument must not offend or be driven by bias. The rubrics have no bias or anything offensive because they just measure language. Probably the only piece that would have to be careful is when you bring in that cultural piece, that there's no cultural bias as far as the target culture or the culture within the student's actual native culture. So for example, if part of it is that the students have to do a comparison between let me think, amusement parks in the US and amusement parks in China, and the student has never gone to an amusement park in Ohio for various reasons, then that's actually going to be kind of biased against the student because they don't know how to do the comparison. So the only piece as far as that we want to be careful for, which we always do, is to make sure that the cultural piece that we're assessing with the students is something that they do have access to personally, and that is not biased or offensive in the target culture. Okay, oh, here's some of the stuff I already mentioned, right? So the rubrics are broken down into 1, 2, 3. The rubrics can be used for performance assessments. They can be used for portfolios, other summative assessments, etc. That's what else that's nice is before we sort of had it in the SLOs, it was IPAs, do the performance assessment, get the scores, etc. What's nice now is it's much more fluid, it's much more open. I've had a lot of teachers talk about doing portfolios, doing projects, just doing more like, summative assessments, especially since you only have to focus on 2 of the skills. So maybe the students do some sort of project, a written project with an oral presentation, or they do a video that has an essay that goes with it. So it's much more open now how you can gather the data. It's really much more in alignment with what we're doing in our classes. Tomorrow, we have a session tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Chris Lemon from, I think he's Northmont Schools, he's going to do a portfolio session for us tomorrow. So if that's something you're interested in, tune in with Chris tomorrow afternoon, because he and I met ahead of time and he showed me what he was doing. And it was a good sort of way to show like, okay, this is one way I could do it.
Kathy, Marilyn Earl asked, can we duplicate and edit these rubrics?
You can, they're in PDF form because the way we put things on ODE is if it's in PDF, it means we don't want it changed because, and if it's put up on the website in Word, it means you can edit it. So as far as the ODE rubrics, we only put them in PDF because the language in them has been aligned to proficiency levels based on our research and our input from experts. If you take the rubric and then you change it, that's fine. I mean, obviously if you want to put in specific, like your own cultural piece in there that you refer to, just either give credit and say this rubric is based on the ODE rubrics, or don't put it out. If you've changed it, don't put it out as an ODE rubric itself, because there may be things on there that aren't necessarily in alignment with what we would have had. So you're welcome to take the rubrics. I know a lot of teachers have said that they take them. I don't know how, there's ways to convert PDFs. It's not like it's impossible to do, just because they want to put in their own things about like, this was the specific culture question. So if you do that and you still want to use it, you can tell your administrator, my rubric is based on the ODE rubrics, and I just tweaked this part with the culture.
And Kathy, there were a couple good reminders from folks in the chat box about some resources that are very useful in converting proficiency rubric scores into gradebook worthy scores. So people might want to check out those comments in the chat box.
Yeah, they're on there. And I know even on our rubric page, when you're on the rubric page, we have, where is it? Right here at the top where it says guides and gradebook conversion. We actually have a couple samples that show the same thing because we want to test your proficiency, but we're also limited by the grade books that still, for the most part, require percents. So yes, thank you to those of you who put resources. If no one else put this one, we also have a document to give some examples of how you can do that. That's a great point. We have proficiency, but we're still sort of limited by the Power School and progress book, etc. Okay, and you can use, there's other rubrics out there. I'm not saying you have to use the ODE ones. Any proficiency-based rubric from ACTFL. I know there's a lot of teachers out there, what we would consider experts in the field. There's National Foreign Language Resource Centers. There's a lot of proficiency-based rubrics out there. You're welcome to use whatever you want. I just refer to the ODE ones because those are the ones I'm most familiar with. Okay, now the second part of the instrument, I'm going to go back to this information from the high quality student data. So we talked about what the tool has to look like. The second thing talks about what the teacher has to do with the data. Okay, so I have the boxes on here, then I'm going to break them down on my handout. So the teacher has to reflect upon, analyze the data, use it as a part of cycle of support for student and learning, which I think we all do. I mean, we give students assessments, formative, summative, etc., to gather information on where they are, where they're going, what do I need to do to inform my learning. So that's just I think typical for a teacher. You have to use the data to look at their learning needs and their styles, identify strengths and weaknesses of an individual class, as well as, of an entire class, as well as individual students. So we're going to talk about that. How am I informing and adapting my instruction based on the data, which again, I think is all part of, we wouldn't give assessments if we weren't looking for data to help us adapt our instruction. And that you have to use the data to measure student learning and their progress towards achieving the standards. So let's break that down. Okay, so the first thing is just basically the first one. So actually reflecting upon, analyzing the data, using the information as a part of an ongoing support. So basically it's what are you doing with this data to drive your instruction and impact student learning? So if you, and this is something we've talked about in different assessment PDs, if you've been in any of mine or anyone's assessment PDs, if you're giving an assessment and you can't clarify what am I going to do with the data I'm getting from this assessment, whether it's a quiz, whether it's a huge project, or if the students can't look at it and say, this is what she's going to use the information from, don't give that assessment because it's wasting your time, it's wasting the kids' time. The goal is that if I'm giving you a formative assessment or I'm giving you a summative assessment, I'm giving it to you for a reason. I want to find out where you are so you can give me feedback on my instruction and I can also get feedback on your learning. So that's what we mean by that. High quality student data is data that actually serves a purpose that will drive your instruction and will impact student learning. It's like I said, there was somebody mentioned that, I think it might have been John Hattie had a thing about that. If you can't elaborate or elocute, whatever the word is that I want, if you can't explain what you're going to do with the data from a quiz or a test or a project, then you probably shouldn't be giving that assessment. Okay, so the next thing you want to do with the data is you want to consider the student learning needs and styles, identify their strengths and weaknesses of an entire class as well as individual students. This is again a piece where we have much more flexibility than we had under the SLOs or the OTES 1.0. And like I said, when I was meeting with Catherine, we brainstormed a lot about what would this look like in a world language class. So again, the first thing you have to do is you have to find out from your district, what's their definition of growth for most students? Do they want it for 51%? Do they need it, for 90%? Do they want it for your biggest class? So that's the first thing you have to find out. So it could be a group of some small groups. It could be a large group. There could be different ways to mix and match it depending on what your district has set up for most students. So for example, say you do some pre-assessments and you have a small AP class, maybe you got 10, 15 kids in there or something like that. And you see that my students have very strong writing skills already. So they're level 4 kids and they're already intermediate, mid, high in their writing. So you decide that you're going to focus on this strength. And so you're going to use the data that you gathered to plan instruction to help them move to the next proficiency level, and maybe qualify for the Ohio State by literacy. But you're like, they already have strong writing skills. Since this is already a strength, I'm going to focus on growing those writing skills even higher. So this is what I mean, where before it was sort of like get the students to get the lowest possible score we can for everything, so we can show that they grew over the year. Whereas now it's like, you know what, if there's kids who are really strong, I'm not going to ignore them. I can take them also and allow them to grow. Here's another example that we were brainstorming. So you have 3 large classes of Spanish 2, and you give, a variety of pre-assessments, and you see that listening is an area of weakness for most of your students. So they're in Spanish 2, and most of them are coming in novice low to mid in their listening, where you really were hoping they might be novice mid to novice high. So now you're like, okay, you know what? I see that really as an area of growth. I probably shouldn't say weakness, maybe area of growth is probably a better word. What am I going to do to help students move up in their listening proficiency, or their viewing, or their reading proficiency? So maybe right now, most of them are scoring in novice low 3 to novice mid 1 range. And again, I'm referring to the ODE rubrics. I'm going to try and get my students to novice mid 3, or even up to novice high 1. So again, so you can focus on strengths, you can focus on weaknesses in quotes, or areas of growth. The other thing you may find is you may have these 3 large classes of Spanish 2, and in the same group of Spanish 2, maybe you have a group of heritage speakers who have very strong speaking skills, like they're already intermediate, mid to high, and they're only in Spanish 2. So you decide, okay, I'm going to focus on this. One of my areas I'm going to focus on is the listening, to try and grow that. But also I'm going to focus on another skill. Another group is going to be my heritage students, and I'm going to focus on really pushing their speaking skills to a higher level. So this is what it means on this, about where you have to find out from your administrator, how many students do we need to show growth for? And then, like I said, you can sort of mix and match. You can focus on large groups and small groups. You can focus on strengths and weaknesses. You can really focus on whatever you want, just within the parameters of what your district is going to require. Are there questions on that one, Ryan? Because I feel like that one might be a little more confusing.
We have a whole slew of questions.
Okay, I'll tell you what, let me get through my last thing, because I'm almost.
That's kind of what I was waiting.
Yeah, okay. And then we'll pull up the chat box and look at the questions. Okay, the other thing you have to do with the data is you just have to inform instruction, adapt instruction, meet student needs from the data. I mean, that's sort of what we've been talking about. Okay, so I get this data back, and I see, that I'm still working on listening, and my students are still struggling with it. What am I going to do to focus on improving that? Oh, the other thing, do I have here yet? The other thing I think I forgot, I think we skipped over it initially, is remember how I said at the beginning, it's not like you have to, that first week of school, give that huge IPA where you had to test all 4 skills in 1 week. And it was just a horrendous way to start our class, not the way we wanted to build community. The other thing is, once your administrator has determined the time period, so maybe they say you have to, show growth over 4 months or 6 months or a semester. And again, if they have a specific start and stop date, you have to follow that because it's the district. But if they're a little more flexible, you may spend the first few weeks doing a few reading assessments, doing a few writing, doing some listening, doing some speaking, where it's not that intense. I've got to figure out where they are right now so I can set my growth target. This is much more of a relief, because you may find giving 2 or 3 reading assessments gives you a much more accurate spot of where they are and where they can possibly go. So I did want to point that out, that again, this whole switch to local control takes a lot of it out of what ODE can say, you have to do it this way. But if you have a little bit of flexibility in that time frame, spread out your assessments a little bit, so you're not just trying to do that all 4 skills within 1 week. And again, do some assessment of all 4 skills along the first few weeks, and then pick the 2 areas that you're like, I really want to focus on these 2 areas the most. Okay, so that was sort of this one. And then again, with the data, you have to measure student learning and progress towards the standards, which goes back to what we talked about in part 1. And then the final question, and this is on the last part of the rubric, the OTES rubric, is what evidence will I provide? And this is where you have to talk to your administrator again, because on the rubric, the OTES rubric, one of the element is evidence of student learning, and I just picked the skilled area. that you have to show the evidence to your administrator of how that is demonstrating that your students grew in proficiency according to the standards. And again, this isn't like before where you had that whole chart where you put the before and the after score. If you go in and look at the data page where you document the growth, it's really that the administrator sort of signs off on, yes, the teacher demonstrated growth. So it's really just a one-page, very, very simple, because the administrator or your district determines how are you going to show that evidence. Okay, that's sort of everything. There's other things on here. Like I said, we're working on a page for world languages. We're replacing the SLO page to try and get you what we can on there. I've got a couple things on there. The folder has some assessments, the rubrics for proficiency, the OTES rubric, the web page for all the OTES 2.0. As far as the sample assessments, you can go in and look at them, but any of you who have gone to any workshop, whether it's my workshop or ACTFL or OFLA or anyone who's done a workshop, those performance assessments across the different skills with proficiency levels, that's what we're looking for. Okay, I'm going to pull up the chat box also, Ryan, so I can sort of, and Ryan, if you want to, actually, Ryan, go ahead and ask the questions. I'll sort of look at the chat box on the side.
All right, so I want to go back to Lisa Howie's question.
Okay.
A couple questions up. With the old SLOs, we were allowed to assume novice low 0 with level 1 students. Is that still the same, or do we have to give them a test that will completely demoralize them from day one?
Yeah, and that's what we're talking about. That's where hopefully with flexibility with the timeline that your district is showing. If again, it's back to the administrator. So if the administrator is like, you have to start on the first day from whatever they have, if you have every student in there and they've never had any type of language before, hopefully you could just assume novice low 0. But again, you're going to have the administrator. What might be nice though is if your administrator is like, you know what, you just have to do 4 months or a quarter or a semester, is use the first few weeks, get some novice low, get some activities going with the students and do some reading, writing, speaking, listening, because you're doing that anyway at the beginning of the year in level 1 courses, whether you're assessing or not. And that way it will give you a better idea of where to focus. Like you may do it and realize that, oh my gosh, I'm doing reading and my students are just they're struggling so much, even with just basic literacy, even reading words. So you may be like, you know what, their reading is really an area I'm going to focus on. You may give them some listening things, and you may have different classes are different. You may just have one of those classes where their listening skills are just amazing. And you're like, you know what, I think I'm going to push the listening skills, or you know what, I'm really going to focus on the reading and the writing because those were issues. So again, everything goes back to local control, Lisa, about where does the district want you to start and what tools can you use?
All right, and then the next question is from Jane Chang. For teachers who teach multi-levels of classes, are they evaluated based on only one level or in one class? And is this a local decision which level or which class the teachers are going to choose?
Yeah, that goes back to the that thing by the administrator right here. This goes back to this line right here. The district determines what most students mean. So if the district says, and this is similar to how it was in the other one, if the district says you have to show growth for at least 80, you have to assess at least 80% of your students for OTES 2.0, but it's up to you to determine what makes up that 80%, then you could choose whatever you want. So again, it is going to be a local decision based on what the district says.
And then next is just a kind of a powerful comment that was made by Jessica Berlucci, just about how to turn lemons into lemonades in terms of giving those pre-assessments and how to kind of approach it with students in a way that it's more of a positive thing than this, overwhelming hurdle that they have to get over.
Yeah, and I think, any one of us, we all know part of backward design is doing a pre-assessment. If you're going to teach a unit on, whatever holidays in Spain or France or Germany or Japan or whatever, we always start with, okay, what are the holidays? What are the most popular holidays in the US? What holidays do you know about in Spain or China? So pre-assessments are just a part of teaching in general and learning. And I think also, because the students were very quick to pick up on OTES 1.0. They were very quick to pick up on, oh my gosh, my teacher's evaluation is based on what I do. Now it's not even that big of a deal. So it's not even like you have to say, this is a pre-assessment for my OTES 2.0, because you don't even have to document it that succinctly anymore. It's just sort of, you're just doing pre-assessments because you always do them anyway. And you don't even have to necessarily call it a pre-assessment. It's just doing some formative assessments as you go, and then using that data to drive instruction. So I don't even know if you don't have to spell it out the way you did before, because it shouldn't be this big obvious thing like it used to be before. So I think you're right. I know when I first saw what OTES 2.0 was involved, the first thought was, oh my gosh, world language teachers are going to be so relieved, because this is just takes off all that stress that I know you were going through that first week of school. So hopefully this is just much more like, I'm already doing this anyway. I just have to document it for someone outside of my classroom.
Next question is from Andrea Minto. She says, for the 2 skills that we must demonstrate, can it be 2 things within one skill or mode? For example, presentational speaking and presentational writing, or must it be 2 separate skills? For example, presentational speaking and then maybe interpersonal speaking.
No, it can be whichever one you want. It can be any 2 skills you want. Yeah, that's what's nice. So if you're like, I really want to focus on interpretive reading and interpretive listening, you don't want to be limited that, oh, I can only do one interpretive thing. So it's whatever, that's what we're saying with the data. Look at all the data that you get, gather data across the different areas, culture, skills, et cetera. And then from that data, choose 2 areas that you want to focus on, whichever 2 you think are the most appropriate for you.
All right, and then the next one, actually, I can probably answer. This is from Sammy Zhao. She said, in terms of the seal of biliteracy, is it possible that ODE uses a different set of criteria for the level 4 languages, like Chinese and Latin, which requires students to need more time and effort to achieve the same proficiency level as their peers who learn Spanish and French?
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan, take that one.
Yeah, so no different criteria. The criteria has to be the same, because that level of proficiency at intermediate high, is the state established bar. What we need to do is we need to educate our district decision makers about the lengths of our programs, and we need to convince them that in order for students in higher difficulty languages, that we need to back those programs down into the middle school or even into the upper elementary school. That's how you're going to have the time to get kids to that level of proficiency. Too many administrators don't understand that different languages exhibit different degrees of difficulty for native English speakers. We have to educate them about that, and then we have to convince them to back our programs down.
And just a little shout out on Thursday, Ryan's doing a thing on implementing a seal by literacy. So if you're interested in that, Thursday morning, Ryan has a session on that. Okay, anything else on there, Ryan? I see a lot of questions.
Let's see, do HQSD assessments need to use authentic resources?
If yes, to be aligned to the standards, they do, because the standards, and that's not saying you can only use authentic resources in your classroom. Teachers use a mixture. That's fine. But since you have to align to the standards are based on what students can do with authentic materials. So for when you're gathering that HQSD, yeah, you want to use authentic materials. But that could be as simple as an infographic, a menu. I mean, appropriate level authentic materials.
Yeah, and I think that's everything. And Latin is a level 1 difficulty language. Someone asked about what level of difficulty Latin is. It's a level 1, right along with Spanish, French. All of the Romance languages and Latin are level 1 difficulty languages.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, actually, I got to get, if there's a question, put it in the chat box. In the meantime, I'm going to get the exit survey link for you. Hang on.
One final question here. So to clarify, we can use an existing IPA that assesses at least 2 skills.
Well, an IPA by its very name assesses all the skills. So, but if you have a summative assessment, that's like, if you have an assessment that has like a reading and a speaking portion, and you're grading it with the proficiency rubrics, yeah. So probably a performance assessment might be a better word versus an IPA.
I think that's all of the questions.
Okay, cool. I'm putting in the chat box here the exit survey. Okay, I'm going to put the link for the exit survey, and this is also for if you need contact hours. So it just gives you a chance to put some feedback for this session, and if you need contact hours, let us know. Give us a couple weeks on the contact hours. We've got about, I think all the content areas are doing their thing, so we probably have about 80 or 90 different sessions going on that we have to get contact hours. So. Oh, if the teacher has consistently high performing teacher designation, do they still get evaluated 2.0? If you go on to, Lori, if you go onto the OTES 2.0, the ODE page, it gives you that whole breakdown about the cycle of how often you have to be evaluated and everything. Okay, well, our next session starts at, Lori, thank you, yeah. I will say the materials on the OTES 2.0 page are very clear, they're very straightforward. I think it's just sort of it'll be a relief to everybody to realize it's a little bit more in line with what I think as teachers, it doesn't feel like you're jumping through hoops anymore. It really feels like, okay, I already do this anyway, I just have to show what I do. So our next session will start at 2:20, same link as this one, so I'll give you a little break. And it's going to be on reducing anxiety in the world language classroom, and that's going to be with Shauna Torrington. So at that point, I'm going to pause the recording.
Everyone is